Sorry to cut you off, it's because we were doing to move on to something else that was, frankly, not all that easy to understand. This time it was from the Prime Minister, who was speaking at an event in Northern Ireland yesterday, speaking to Northern Ireland Conservatives to try to make sense to them of his Brexit deal. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
Peace and everything else, right? But so when you come out of the EU customs union, which is what we've done, you have to have some way of checking that goods that might attract a tariff going from the United Kingdom into Ireland pay that tariff if there is to be a tariff. The only place you can do it, if you don't do it at the border, is at the border in Northern Ireland. There will not be tariffs or checks on goods coming from GB to I that are not going on to Ireland. That's the whole point. And the great thing that's been misunderstood about this is there will not be checks. There will not be checks. I speak as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and a passionate unionist. There will not be checks on goods going from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. Because we're the government of the United Kingdom and we will not institute or implement or enact such checks. And the idea that Tato crisps from Tandrake Castle are going to be, by some process, it's just nonsense. So actually, Northern Ireland has got a great deal. It's got a great deal. You keep free movement, you keep access to the city market, but you also have, as it says in the deal, unfettered access to GB.
Well, I hope that was all perfectly clear. We'll be taking exam questions at the end of the programme, just to see what the Prime Minister really was trying to say, and whether, as many on social media are claiming, that it wasn't quite what's actually in his deal. Let's join the BBC's reality check correspondent, Chris Morris. Chris, there are people, aren't there, saying that he actually hasn't understood his own policy. Could you see any problems with what the Prime Minister was saying there?
Yeah, follow that, as they say, Nick. I mean, there are two things, aren't there? There's goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. Let's deal with that one first. He said there'll be absolutely no checks, which is basically true, but there will be. This was confirmed by the government late last month after some confusion in parliamentary select committees. Those goods will be subject to export declarations. So who checks whether the export declarations have been filled in correctly, and when is a check not a check? This will not be a bloke in a peak cap standing in a booth at the side of the road. But is it really the absolute unfettered access to the GB market which Northern Ireland has been promised? That really matters in Northern Ireland, and there are those who say even if this is a minimal administrative procedure, it still doesn't meet that promise of completely unfettered access. So the government says no checks whatsoever. You speak to most trade experts and they say until we see the detail of how this rather unique system's going to work, of Northern Ireland staying in the UK customs territory but also following EU customs rules, we can't say for sure that checks have to take place. And so that's the trade going in one way.
I was going to say the other way that he made a big play of, didn't he? It was a great waving of arms about no checks at all when trade goes from Northern Ireland to GB, because of course that's central to the politics of whether the Union, the United Kingdom, is still one. What did you make of that?
So GB to Northern Ireland is even more complicated in a way. So two things he said. He said there'd be no tariffs and no checks unless goods are moving on to the Republic of Ireland. And that's not what his deal says. The deal says that if goods are deemed to be at risk of moving to the Republic of Ireland after going from GB to Northern Ireland, then they could be subject to tariffs. If it then turns out those goods stay in Northern Ireland, companies will be eligible for a rebate on those tariffs, but the tariff would initially have to be paid. As for checks, much more complicated, because Northern Ireland, under the terms of his own deal, will stay in a single regulatory zone with the Republic of Ireland, which will follow EU rules and regulations. And as you know, those are particularly strict on things like food and products of animal origin. Those consignments going from GB to Northern Ireland, every one of them would have to have a documentary check, and there would be a certain number that would have to be physically checked. Now, you can point to a country like New Zealand, where they've done a deal where only 1% of consignments of New Zealand lamb arriving in the EU are ever checked. But to get that deal, New Zealand lamb producers have had to sign up to following nearly all EU rules and regulations.
There's the key to it.
So if you want to diverge in the future, that's a problem.
I want to bring in Suella now. Suella Braverman, you quit as a Brexit minister because you didn't like Theresa May's deal, but you signed up to Boris Johnson's deal. And to simplify this very complicated thing, what Chris Morris is saying is either you follow most of the EU's rules, then you don't need any checks, which you object to, or you don't follow the EU rules, which you want, and then there have to be checks. And Boris Johnson has not reinvented the politics of Brexit. That is always going to be the case.
Well, the situation here is that there's a difference between customs declarations and formalities on the one hand and physical customs checks. And I think in this discussion they're being conflated a little bit. When it comes to formalities and declarations, they're part of transactions at the border today. They are required for exports and imports on registration and for VAT. And they require an extra line on an invoice. They can be done digitally and they can be done away from a border. They're a very low impact on the settlement with Northern Ireland, Great Britain and Ireland. Physical customs checks, on the other hand, are very rare. They're less than 1% at the moment.
But they still exist. I mean, the thing that's difficult about this is what the Prime Minister wants to say, kicks balls, isn't it? Is no checks. What's all the fuss about? There won't be any checks. And it seems to me everything we hear is there will be checks of some form. You can argue how big the checks are, how many the checks are, how often they'll be carried out.
Yes, and I think the government wants to make this distinction between paperwork and checks, but I think ultimately it comes back to one of the DUP's big concerns with what's been proposed and the reason they couldn't support it is they feel Northern Irish have unfettered access to the UK market. No, I think that even if you just have mainly extra paperwork and say the occasional check, is that going to make things harder for businesses in Northern Ireland? And I think that if you start to see these businesses unfairly discriminated against or some in the main island being put off, I think that's when the government is going to come to pressure to step in and come up with solutions, because that would be a big political problem and a problem for people living there.
And I think what is interesting about this particular clip is that Boris Johnson knows full well this checks, paperwork, whatever, is going right over the head of most of the people in this country. But what I think it illustrates more than anything is we have a Prime Minister who's the kind of bloke who likes to be liked. So when he's standing in a potato crisp factory or whatever in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and he will say whatever is going to make those people standing in front of him happy and make them like him. The concern you have then is he's then in a different environment and he will say something entirely different to those people. And people like that get away with it for a while, but then one day it all comes horribly unravelled, and I'm sure I can convince you that is where we are going.
Oh, that's really unfair. I don't think that's right at all. I think
true.
Boris Johnson is someone who fronts up completely.
So that clip there was him
He's very clear about this deal. He's very clear about the implications of it.
I mean, apart from clearly he doesn't know about his deal.
That's not right.
Look at that clip. Look at the way this man is behaving. He is asking for the top job in this country. He is rambling. It looks like he's been drinking. It's just not a good look. And actually, I find
we
it
should
quite...
stress that we do know that that was water in that glass, because there are people on social media
but like,
who jokingly
look at
call
how
it a
he's...
drunk uncle look.
But
Apparently it was water.
It looks so rambling and incoherent.
But I think
and he's not taking the electorate seriously if he's going to behave that way, because apart from not being able to explain his deal and going around in circles and just making people laugh, it just highlights that he's just not serious. He's not a serious contender for this job.
I just think he will say anything to anyone to get where he wants to be, and the consequences are really of no interest.
I'll tell you what,
I do think just one of the problems here is, I mean, Boris Johnson's style has always been rambling, and yes, there is a tendency that whoever has a meeting with him often leaves thinking they've got what they wanted. But ultimately, I think the bigger issue is there has been confusion across government on this. You had Stephen Barclay previously having to clarify comments later on, and it does build up to this sense that the whole government isn't on top of it.
Just briefly and finally on this one, if I may. You've been away for a few weeks. Are you sure you've got this right? There are a lot of people who agree with you on Brexit, passionate leavers, who are looking at this deal and going, maybe it's not quite what he said it was.
Oh, I have no hesitation in supporting this deal as someone who resigned over the terms of the previous deal. It delivers Brexit, it gets it done so that we can move on and make next year an exciting, positive agenda for our country.